Welcome to the Homeschool Together podcast. Where one working mom and a stay-at-home dad help you navigate the nuts and bolts of the growing and dynamic world of homeschooling.
With a focus on early learners, like me.
All the ins and outs of building and maintaining your homeschool life.
Homeschool.
Find out tips and tricks to make things like this easier.
I'm reading.
And ultimately, enjoy educating your kids. And what's that last thing?
Have fun together. Did I do good, Daddy?
Yeah, you did, sweetie. Good job. Welcome back to Homeschool Together. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have a chance, head down into the show notes and check out our YouTube channel. And if you could, leave us a nice, wonderful review there on iTunes, and it really helps people find us. We're getting close to 100, I believe, 100 reviews.
Yeah, we're working towards it.
We are working towards it. Today, we are kicking off another series. We did a whole month of bettering yourself and self-care month that we did earlier this year. We are starting and embarking on a brand new month-long exercise around writing.
A theme, if you will. Yes, we're trying to
be more thoughtful in what we're scheduling, because we know that a lot of you, if you guys have been following us from the beginning, and you are sitting here at this kind of second grade, first grade, third grade, fourth grade level, you guys are going to be beginning to look into the idea of writing, and writing well, and encouraging our learners to write. Not just simple composition stuff, but maybe even short fiction or poems or whatever it might be. And so we wanted to kick off this entire month of talking about writing and improving writing habits and helping our children, cultivate that love of writing, because we know it can be very challenging. And I know our guest today talked about how writing can be just as challenging as learning to read or learning to do math.
It's another skill.
Absolutely. So we welcome back Jeanne Faulconer, who we had on, I think, was it this year or last year?
So we had Jeanne come on the show and do a couple of great episodes for us. She works for the Homeschool Mom. She does a lot of writing there and has really great insights about all kinds of great homeschool topics, and she'll talk about that. But first and foremost, Jeanne is a writer, and
a homeschool mom.
And a homeschool mom, right? And her kids are grown now, so she's kind of gone through the whole, all the stages, right? All the way to having them graduate college, and so, and she's a writer, and she worked for a while for Brave Writer, so she's pretty familiar with that as well. And so we thought she would be just a great expert to kick off this series. She's so insightful and always gives us great food for thought. And I felt like after we talked with her, I was kind of like, oh man, I wish I would have asked that. Oh no, I thought of that. And she really changed the way that I was thinking about it, because writing is something that's not easy. I think kids do naturally want to tell stories, but when it comes to putting their thoughts down, whether you're going to have them do it in handwriting or you're dictating to them, they're dictating to you and you're scribing for them, or they're starting to type on their own, it's a new thing, and it's a little scary to put your own, put yourself out there.
It's a complex, It's a really complex task. It's more than just reading. It's reading comprehension, and it's thinking, and it's composing, and then there's motor skills and muscle memory and stamina and the revision process and thinking through ideas, improving ideas. It's the whole kit and caboodle type of thing, right? It's a huge topic, and it's not just one. I think what we came out of this was, it's not just a curriculum. It's a kind of a way of thinking. It's going to be a way of thinking and how we approach the day-to-day when it comes to embracing all aspects of writing. And the great thing that Jeanne talked about is that there are all these different stages of writing, and it's an evolution as these children move from these young kindergartners all the way up to a sixth grader or seventh grader who's starting to write poetry. Right. There's a huge growth there, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it's very progressive over time, and things emerge, and you'll have to do different things at different times. You'll have to learn different skills. You'll have to embrace and meet the learner. I think that was a big key that she always talked about: meet the learner where they are, and help them move through those. So I really enjoyed this talk. We covered a whole wide range of writing, not just writing, but also reading. We talked about reading for pleasure and reading for for comprehension and meaning. We talked a little bit about AI at the end, had a nice little discussion there at the end as well. This was a wide-ranging conversation, and I could not imagine kicking off like a month of talking about writing and not having this right up front.
Yep. I think this is a great start to it. And it really covers all levels. This isn't just for early learners. She talks about high school and middle school and the different stages. Yeah. So this is a great
It's intro. A long interview, but it's well worth the time.
Yeah, this is a real quality one. So we hope
Jeannie's a professional. She's great.
She is terrific. So we hope that you enjoy this wonderful interview with Jeanne Faulconer. Hi, Jeanne. Welcome back.
I'm so glad to be back with you all. Writing is one of my favorite homeschooling topics.
Oh, well, we're excited. We were like, who's the expert that we know about writing?
We're starting to get into this world. Like we've gone from, learning to write our letters to reading. And now we're starting to have to think about composition and writing and whatnot. Yeah. So it's a good time for us we're kind of vicariously, getting educated through this podcast.
I love it. You're growing with the podcast, with your topics. As your kids get older, that's a great way to do it.
That's exactly what.
One day we'll be doing quantum mechanics, like I was giving you my Oppenheimer review before.
That's right.
So for those who haven't listened to our first interview, kind of get us grounded. So, you've been a homeschool mom and you're an author. Can you give us a little bit of background about your writing journey personally?
Sure. I really was always a writer. I grew up knowing that I was a writer. I had a wonderful mom who was not a homeschool mom, but who really knew how to nurture that writing voice. She wrote down my stories before I could write. She bound them into little books. She really did all the very homeschool mom type things that you might expect. And I loved writing and wrote a lot through school. In my first high school job was writing for the weekly newspaper back when we had such things. They are gone the way of the dinosaurs now, but that was what I did instead of working at the Tasty Freeze or whatever. I wrote, covered the town board meetings and whatever else was going on, the county fair and so forth. And went to college, majored in English and journalism, again, back when journalism was not a dying career like it is now. And I eventually ended up teaching English composition and journalism at the college level. So then, of course, taught my own kids and those in homeschool co-ops writing. And as far as my own writing personally, I spent a lot of time doing academic writing, writing for news, and then also writing poetry. I really love writing poetry. I spent a lot of time going to weekly poetry workshops for years working on my poetry. So have done a little bit of everything.
Wow. Well, I think you're the perfect person to ask all about this topic then. So for our homeschool parents, how do we kind of set the stage for writing? How do we create an environment that is conducive to writing and supportive? What should we all be doing?
Writing needs to be safe for kids. So that's the first thing, is writing can feel risky. And so our environment needs to feel not risky to encourage writing. And that can be things as simple as not having paper that falls apart when kids erase on it, or not requiring kids to erase, because that's a big investment. Once they've put writing down on paper and now you're telling them they have to redo it, all of a sudden the risk may be greater than the reward. Maybe I don't want to write anything because if I make a mistake, I'll have to do it again and it's hard. So making a safe environment is really important. It also needs to be comfortable. So, pleasant. You like to do things in a pleasant atmosphere where the environment feels good, literally good lighting, a comfortable place to sit, or a silly place to sit if that feels better. Some kids want to write sitting on the limb of a tree or under the kitchen table, and that works if they're just getting their ideas out. And then I think finally, parents really need to understand that writing needs to be theirs. It needs to belong to the kids. And parents often jump in too quickly and take ownership of how writing should look or read or sound. And it kind of circles back to safety there, but it's a little different thing. What I'm really talking about here is giving kids authorship, letting them be in charge of their own thoughts on paper and not jumping in too quickly to make corrections or challenge them, but to let them own the writing.
So free to make a lot of mistakes is kind of what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Free to make a lot of mistakes. And it's really hard. I tell the story of a kid in my co-op who wrote, we were doing a circle of critiques as we listened to each other's writing. And this was a young high school group. And this one kid was really nervous to participate. So every time it was his turn to comment on the writing, he said, "It needs more ham." And we all just looked at each other. And of course the kids laughed. "It needs more ham." And he did this for a couple weeks. And I just let him do it. He didn't know what. And then one day he said, "That reminds me of this thing that I read," and went on and made a connection. Now, it sounds silly to let him own that thought. It was just a thought. It wasn't even in writing. But instead of fussing at him for it, we just went on to the next person, let him have his moment. He got comfortable. He was allowed the room to make that mistake of, not really commenting on the writing. And then eventually he couldn't resist. Right? The conversation was too good. He couldn't resist. So he got away from "it needs more ham." But I'll never forget it. It was a great way to remember that kids sometimes need to go through that process of being irreverent, of making mistakes, of learning how to be a part of the group.
So you were referencing kind of a younger kid. When, as a family who's listening to this, they're starting to get to that 7, 8 years old, when are they supposed to start thinking about the writing process? Should that start earlier and more of like a pre-writing type of thing? Like how do parents think about, as homeschoolers, introducing this kind of, almost like we think math and reading's hard, and then all of a sudden now we're going to layer it on top of that composition and bringing out ideas. It's almost as daunting of a process as like reading and math at the beginning, these early years that we're in.
It is almost as daunting, and I think it's even less visible, because I think by the time parents start to think, "Oh, I better start thinking about writing composition," their kids have actually been at it for a while in ways that parents haven't noticed, but hopefully they've encouraged just because they are good, nurturing parents. And here's what I mean. We often hear people say, for very young children, toddlers and preschoolers and kindergartners and first graders, that most learning should be through play. And people acknowledge that, and homeschoolers are fond of saying it, but we don't really know, what does that mean? Well, in terms of writing, when kids are doing imaginative play, they are composing in their heads a universe, characters for themselves to inhabit, and their playthings to inhabit. They are already writing without putting a pen to paper or making marks. They are composing in their minds. So that imaginative play that has happened before you've paid attention to it is the beginning of writing. And that's why you want to keep encouraging it and allowing it. And when kids are playing happily some kind of imagination game, you have this instinct, even when they're 7, 8, 9, not to bother it. And it's a good instinct, because what they're doing in that really good imaginative play is developing the life of their mind. So that's already happening. The next stage is probably storytelling, where they are able to listen to stories from parents and read alouds. And then they are also able to begin telling stories. And again, for some kids, this can happen as early as 2, more likely 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And storytelling is the beginning of taking that inner life and moving it toward paper. It's not on paper, it's just toward paper at that point, because it's toward someone else's ear. So storytelling is that next stage. And again, it just goes on while you don't notice it, and you need to encourage it for longer than you think. And for me, the written composition transition happened when I began to write down their stories, just as my mother did for me. And you'll hear this often from writers, that they had someone who really nurtured this early storytelling impulse by helping kids get it down on paper. So, that's kind of how I see the early years of writing.
And that's kind of funny, because one of the things that I've always done with my daughter, we share the putting down duties, but back when she was a lot younger, I was putting her down. We would always do the thing of, tell me the story of your day.
Yeah.
And at the end of the night, we would recount, like, well, what happened. Or if I picked her up from preschool, I go, tell me the story of your preschool. And it's like, okay, daddy dropped you off. Then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? And always kind of thinking about kind of sequentially unfolding, the events, so we can, because a lot of times I say, hey, what happened in preschool? I don't know. Right. But if I approach it from a storytelling thing, they immediately go, oh yeah, then I did this. Then I did this. Then I did this.
Our daughter literally did this yesterday. She was telling Nana all about day camp. And Nana goes, well, what'd you do at camp? She goes, okay, so first daddy drove us there, and then he dropped us off. And she started from, and my mom was like, you don't start quite that early. And I was like, no, don't interrupt the flow. Just
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's wonderful. You have built in a sort of a basic exercise that parents can do with their kids to get them in this sort of narrative flow and to move their inner thoughts to the outside. So I think that's, we do it intuitively if we don't start filling our time with writing exercises that maybe block the intuition or get us panicky sometimes. Yeah, right. So, yeah.
So those are those kind of early years, but then all of a sudden, people are thinking about curriculum choices. What do I have to buy? How do I, implement something that I can then teach them how to do anything? When people are thinking about doing kind of a writing curriculum, what are they looking for in a good curriculum? What are the kind of the hallmarks of a good curriculum that, can help them? Grammar, logic, rhetoric, how do I take those kind of stuffy classic words, and are those needed to be in my writing curriculum, or do I approach it from a different manner?
So you'll obviously find people who have very different opinions on this. Yep. I tend to be a constructivist type of homeschooler who likes to meet my kids where they are and move them toward the next right thing. And for me, for composition, that meant not putting a lot of emphasis early on grammar and logic and rhetoric through a textbook. And so what I look for in an early writing curriculum where you're actually trying to encourage composition is whether it engages the child. So a lot of times this means trial and error. Some kids want a writing curriculum or respond to a writing curriculum that tells them exactly what to do. How to add adjectives, how to make writing more of a formula. But in my experience, most kids, my kids, actually are the other way. They need to be unblocked and need to have a writing curriculum that invites them to write, again, in a safe environment, and it allows them to have authorship over their writing, and it encourages them gradually to learn to write to forms. So, for example, we all know that there's a place in the world for the 5-paragraph essay. I personally don't think there's a very big place for it at all. I'm not a fan. They don't really.
Neither are most kids.
Right. And neither are most kids. And neither are college professors. I mean, it's a bosses, it's a very artificial formulaic type of writing. However, it is a formula that it helps some kids organize their thoughts. But it's just a form. And there are other forms that parents can use. And I'm going to use examples from Julie Bogart's Brave Writer program. She gives one example of a project where she has kids draw the outline of their body on butcher paper. Now, everybody's done that, and we usually then have kids put in, draw their eyes and nose and all that kind of stuff. But she has this idea of having them actually write little things about themselves. So, my eyes are blue. Scrawl that on the margin, great big on the side of the butcher block paper, or my hands like paint, and so on and so on. It seems not like a form, but it is a form, just like a lap book is a form. And so when our kids are young, we don't need to impose a form that's not going to be needed until they're in 6th or 7th or 8th grade. We need to use forms that are friendly to them, that they can grow with. And what's happening is they are still getting that inner life of their mind out, and they are getting practice using a form, but the form is scaffolded to be at the exact place where they are, instead of some place way out there that they can't reach yet. And it's the same thing for grammar. I mean, one of my kids is a musician, and I'll never forget when he said to me one time, some music lessons are too many scales and not enough music. And that's what can happen with writing. Some writing lessons are too much grammar and not enough thinking and communicating. And so for little kids and slightly getting older kids, we really need to make sure we're not imposing form and grammar that cuts the thought off at the knees.
And when you talk about form, does that also talk about like the genre? Like, it's a lot of times when people think about writing, they're thinking of like kind of the 5-paragraph essay. Are you suggesting, embracing whatever type of writing they would like to do, whether it's poetry, as you said, that was passionate about, or comics or graphic novels, or maybe they want to write short stories or whatever it might be? So are you saying unbound not only just the technical aspect of writing, but also, the subject matter that they're writing about?
100%. And not just the subject matter and the technical aspect, but also I think there is a bias against creative writing in homeschooling. I will sometimes read on Reddit or Facebook groups, oh, such and such a curriculum or such and such a project is only creative writing. Well, give me a kid who can do creative writing, and I'll show you a kid who can later write about quantum mechanics, as you brought up when you were mentioning the Oppenheimer movie. Creative writing is challenging, and it is not less than, and it builds engagement. And I have over and over and over been privileged to see kids make this change. And it's different. For some kids it comes 4th grade, for some kids it comes 7th grade, for some kids it comes when they take their first college class, where they have then read enough essays, which should be part of our job as parents, or have done enough research that they realize that telling a story in the once upon a time mode is not going to be the right form. And they begin to want their form to match what is expected of their peers. And so it comes along if we are patient. And so to circle it back to curriculum, I think for me, a writing curriculum needs to respect this process rather than trying to push kids to get all the grammar right, all the thinking right, all the handwriting right, all of the form in some way that is acceptable for a high schooler, and put all that together. It's too much. It's not developmentally appropriate. So
do you think that that a writing curriculum is a necessity for a homeschool family, or is it something that we have a homeschooler who's just really reluctant to write at all? They don't want to touch it. So it's like, I'm going to get something fun like Brave Writer or another program to just help them get out of their shell. Or if you've got a student who's, not reluctant to write, do you just start making writing an integral part of all of your other studies and start kind of piecing it in? Like, what's your advice for families on, how necessary it is to purchase and follow, yet another, we start stacking curriculums at some point as we get older and we're like, oh, that's another one I got to do, so.
That's a great question. I think that what parents should always ask themselves is my child engaged? And is my child continuing to learn and progress? So a child who is a really good writer, you might say, oh, they don't need a curriculum, they're such a good writer. But they also might get bored if they aren't given ideas of how to keep going with their writing. So sometimes you need that as inspiration, and so that they understand that they can do even more with their writing than they're aware of. And the same thing can be true with kids at the other end. Very reluctant kids may benefit from instruction that encourages and supports them where they are, rather than just saying, oh, they'll get it. So sometimes curriculum can help at either end. Now, I am a huge fan of interdisciplinary learning. And so if you have a kid who loves dinosaurs, which I think we talked about in one of the last podcasts that we did, one of the last episodes, if they love dinosaurs and they start writing a story about dinosaurs and they are in 3rd or 4th grade and they are, making sure that they use the right names of the dinosaurs at least part of the time, and they're getting some of the characteristics of the dinosaurs, and they're telling a narrative story about the dinosaurs, and they're engaged, and their writing is from this year is looking better than it was last year, that may be all the curriculum you need, because you don't want a curriculum to do damage to what may be happening organically. So I think all of this is a matter of judgment. And that's one of the hard things about homeschooling, is that we second guess ourselves when we're using that judgment, but it's really okay to say, my child is flourishing already with the writing that they are enjoying and showing improvement in, or my child actually would like to do more, or my child is reluctant and I don't seem to be able to pull it out of them on my own. Maybe we need some extra help.
So maybe pivoting from kind of the creative aspect and the early writing, a lot of us know that when we start to do history, even English and things of that nature, they may have to write a little bit more critically and may have to actually defend ideas. How do you walk that kind of fine line between, as you said, being a parent and not, pushing them into an area where they don't want to be, meeting them where they need to be, but also being, critical and saying, hey, your ideas here may need to be, what are you thinking about here? Or what's your thoughts on this? And having to defend that idea in writing, how can we navigate that in a creative manner that's, fun and enriching without being negative? I mean, we've all had those teachers that are like, C- because I didn't like your argument. And there's obviously better ways to approach that. And, how can we do that as parents?
So you actually answered it in your question when you gave some examples about asking questions. You said, oh, I can't put it back to you now, but you gave questions that you might ask a kid, and that is helping them test their ideas. So for homeschoolers, I like to say the dinner table conversation, text and emailing with family, forums, and debate. So dinner table conversation, when kids come up with these wild statements that can't be true or are partly true or might be true, but they don't actually have the evidence for it, the writing with a critical thinking lens on comes from conversation with a critical thinking lens on. So it comes when I say, where did you read that? what do you know about that source? Is that really a good source? Why do you think that? Oh, that sounds like a statistic. Do you know how this kind of statistic works? And so my kids would say, she's always going to be the devil's advocate. And constantly I would challenge them on things that I actually agreed with, taking the side of something that I didn't agree with, just in order to have them test their ideas. And we did this just conversationally all day long, and it could not help but bleed into their writing. We also did it by text and email and even by Slack, where and I've got grown adult kids today, and this still goes on. Somebody sends me an article and I say, what about this? And they do it back to me. Mom, did you know that podcaster has had this criticism of him? And so it's a conversation that has to take place, because again, what you're doing is training the mind. The pen can't write on paper critical thinking thoughts that the mind hasn't learned to deal with. And so conversation in the house, at the dinner table, not just at lesson time, through texting, through email, all of that works. Now, my kids also got a lot of this kind of experience in forums when they were in high school, when they had a little more freedom on the internet. I know we all have to be sort of concerned about that kind of thing, but they had things that they wanted to explain to people and prove to people. And sometimes they would come to me and say, they just don't get it. How can I get them to understand what I'm trying to get across? And I'm talking, these are tech forums and gaming forums and music forums. And it doesn't, some of that may not seem important to parents, but this is a training ground where to them, it really matters if their opinion is understood. And so that's how it begins. And formal debate actually can be a part of this too, where critical thinking, again, it's oral, but it's with preparation and research. And then that informs how you will write later. So then when we're actually looking at, a kid's paper that was written on a science or a history or a social topic, they are not going to be floored by the fact that we're asking these questions of their paper, because we've been doing it all along. They will expect it, and they'll have that conversation. And over, my kids, again, in co-op and in my own family, would say, oh, I need to put that part in there about where that statistic came from. Or I see you're saying that's just an anecdote. It's not actually something that would happen every time in that circumstance. And I need to fix that in my writing. So it comes along, but when you try to do it in an isolated way, just at their writing, and you've never cultivated this kind of conversation before, it can really shut down a writer. And that's especially something you don't want to do with a teenager, because they're really wanting to start to express these opinions and understand the world and get their points across. If you haven't had that kind of relationship all along, it can be very off-putting, to have them hand you a paper and then you just say, well, this doesn't make sense because of this and this and this. Ask questions. Inquiry-based learning is where the critical thinking skills are developed.
Is there a moment where you see that transition where it goes from a young student who is articulating story to trying to articulate more meaning behind, and I'll use an example. A lot of times I've seen my cousins do this, where once they hit a certain age, people start to become interested in music, not just because it's fun to dance to, but because they like the lyrics and they want to understand the poetry behind them, or they watch a movie and that inspires them to write a short story, or they're writing poetry on their own. You tend to see that change when they begin that adolescent kind of change, like that 10, 11, 12 years old, where things begin to envelop more meaning behind them. Is that a moment where you need to make some changes in how you approach writing, or actually be more behind them and push them in the right direction?
I think this is a great time for kids to have an audience besides their dad and their mom.
Mhm.
If you can get these writers who are 10, 11, 12, 13 and up in, it doesn't even have to be very many people, but if you have one or two other families, or you can invite one or two other kids over and have them share writing together. Of course, if they are competitive or they are bullying or whatever, if they're bad dynamics, it doesn't work. But if you have good dynamics, this idea of almost having a kind of Socratic salon type session feels very grown up to them, and they begin to feel that they have an audience that goes beyond the parent, and that's very important for keeping a student wanting to continue to get better, because they realize, oh, it's not just that my parent wants me to write this, it's that this has a role in the world, and my friend wants to know what I think about it, and my other friend commented on how I worded something. And so I do think that bringing groups into play, small groups, does help these kids who are getting older.
Well, and I've seen that with some writer friends of mine on a platform called Scribophile, where they will crowdsource editing their stories, and they'll critique in, you know, a non-judgmental way, but they'll help each other, and almost like a critique group, and how much benefit that gives them and becoming better and better writers. And I speak of writers in that sense because we've always heard that good writers are good readers, and they tend to read wide. And how can, you know, we cultivate better writers through better readers?
It's definitely true that reading, and I'll throw in listening to audiobooks, which I think we can talk about later as well, but and also I think discussions and knowledge and content and a good life of the mind all are connected to becoming a good writer. So a good writer will have more vocabulary and more language experience if they've read a lot, but they will also get that from listening, and they will also get that from those good discussions that are back and forth about their writing. And knowledge is an important thing too. One thing that I didn't talk about at the very beginning that I probably should have is I am a big believer in a process that starts with free writing and then goes through a revision process and then finally an editing and proofreading process. And adding knowledge and content to a free writing paper is an example of a revision that can really take things to a higher level. And a lot of that knowledge is gained through reading. So when kids, let's go back to our dinosaur example, when kids are wanting to write something, if they have developed knowledge because they have heard, I don't know how many dinosaur books, and maybe they've also taken field trips and seen fossils in the museum, all of this builds knowledge, and it's all connected to reading, and then it can come back out in the writing. So I think it is often a question of having enough input in order to have output. So writing's the output, and reading is one of the main inputs that can fill up a kid so that they have enough to say when they want to go to write.
And, you know, I think that term, good readers make good writers, is maybe an older term because now we have so much more ways of consuming content, like what you said with like essays or listening to things or audiobooks. And I think there were less choices back in the day. And I think you're right, there's so many more opportunities to have different inputs that can help hone and improve whatever that output is. But one of the things that I always like is a question of quality. You know, is they reading a bunch of, and I'm not going to upset my
Magic
wife here.
Treehouse.
If somebody reads a lot of trashy romance novels and I hug her,
listen,
right here, versus reading
attacked, personally attacked.
Anna Karenina right there. What, you know, how do we as parents go, okay, I know you should probably read, you know, whatever classic book it is, but you really love to read Artemis Fowl,
Right.
and or Harry Potter or whatever it might be. How do we balance those things without losing our kids?
Well, if you try too hard to balance them and you lose your kids, there is no balance.
Mm-hmm.
So it will happen one way or the other. And you can try to force it so that they are only reading what you consider, classic literature or whatever. But if that doesn't engage them, then it won't engage them, and you will not have made any mileage by trying to keep that other kind of literature out of your house. So it's very tricky. I found that letting my kids have a lot of choice of what to read, as long as it, fit our family values, worked really well. And then my read alouds, I would often find ways to make those some of the titles that I thought they should, with air quotes, read. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to work pretty well, because over time, they also began to see the difference. And it was almost a difference in how they felt. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes they would come to me and say, I want to read a good book next. And what they meant by that was something that had a little bit more substance to it, perhaps. But then they were right back to Artemis Fowl, because that is fun and engaging, mm-hmm. and keeps you on to the next thing. And I let them have at it, but I might be reading a classic to them aloud, which kind of takes the pain out of it a little bit, maybe. And if an adult is a good reader, they can do a lot with inflection and warmth and being there to answer questions and that sort of thing, that makes a read aloud a really good way to have an entree into literature that is not romance novels.
I'm not.
Listen,
I'm not.
Just because I don't like the classics. I'm the one in grad school. I've gotten an A. I've aced every paper. So it's not that. It's just that,
you're a genius.
For fun, I want a sci-fi novel or, a trashy romance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think sometimes kids, I think it's in my mind, and, correct me if this is totally wrong, I feel like it's like a junk food thing, mm-hmm. right? We obviously can't sustain our lives on junk food, but sometimes you want an Oreo. And so I feel like our kids are kind of that way too, where they do know, I think they can sense, some of the books we read through, like Build Your Library, for example, some of the main chapter books, mm-hmm. I think they know those are substance, but then every once in a while they're like, let's just read a Magic Tree House. And, mm-hmm. and I think that they can see, and hopefully they're going to eventually kind of self-select out of the worst of the surface, type books like Magic Tree House. But I kind of feel like it's like that. Like maybe sometimes you need junk food, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're not up for sustenance as well.
Yeah, or like when we just read Tale of Despero by Kate DiCamillo, right? So that's a piece of literature masquerading as a children's book, and I think a lot of times when we talk about the literature, the classics, I think that's kind of like that's coming from the literature side of the house, who tend to be very insular in their opinions on what is defined as literature. And I think there are a lot of things like, a lot of people can make an argument that Harry Potter has a lot of depth in it. And that if in 50 years, when we look back on it, they'll say, okay, that's, no different than the Narnia books from C.S. Lewis or whatever it might be. And they have depth that are as deep as a piece of literature that you could have compared it to, for a children's book. And I think that there may be where those opinions are coming from is maybe diluting what the choice is.
Like, what is literature?
Yeah, what is literature, that type of thing.
What would your definition be, Jeannie, of literature?
I don't know. That's a really hard question. I mean, I think it is storytelling. I mean, literature is storytelling, and that could be in a novel form or a poem form. To me, it can be in a comic book form as far as I'm concerned. Graphic novels now are very literary quite often and are a great way to enter into, things that we might consider, officially more literary. I mean, even among novels, we might consider them all literature, but some are literary and some are maybe what we would call popular or commercial novels. And there's a difference, but I like the way you're saying it, Ariel, where it a balance, a snack of this and a diet of that kind of balance itself out. I will say that when I was teaching in college, two of the finest writers that I worked with as students were comic book aficionados. I mean, they had grown up reading comic books, and they were extremely literate young men who were really strong writers. And many people might not recognize that kind of background as a training ground for writers, but clearly it had been wonderful for them. And people who know about comics actually do understand that. People who read comics regularly and get it, they do know how strong the writing is and has to be. So yeah, it's a balance. It's a balance for sure. And I'll go back and circle back. This is a good place to mention curriculum again, because there are multiple, you've mentioned one, I've mentioned one. There are some good homeschool curricula that are based on literature, children and young adult novels. And these selections are really strong ways to encourage both reading and writing. And some of them often have a writing component and or a celebrate the author component that I think is really good for helping young writers see themselves as writers. So as far as advice to homeschool parents out there, consider those curricula that have, a great book list and have ways of inviting kids into the books with projects and writing assignments that are related to the books and so forth, because this is how you'll get some really, like you said, the Tales of Despero and these other great titles.
So going from, books and graphic novels, what about audiobooks? I have heard, so when we have kind of an emergent reader, finally starting to really take off right now. And we're very, very happy.
So fun.
I know, 4 years of hard work. It's finally paid off. But I've heard from a number of parents saying that audiobooks they felt were a little detrimental to an early reader. And for this one reason is that they were reading really, really good stories and they get access to them almost unlimited. We have Libby through our library. And so my daughter can, I'm just out there putting holds all day long on books.
There's no limits.
There's no limit to, and she's always, and she gets every day, gets her time on audiobooks or quiet time, and she just loves it. Right. And the people are doing the voices and it's super entertaining. But those stories tend to be really good because they're a little bit above her maybe age range.
Sure.
And when she has to then go ahead and read, Pete the Cat or
whatever, the early readers,
it's just not as interesting to her. And we found that to be a little bit of a challenge. Not as much anymore now that she's starting to pick off. But I heard another homeschool family say literally the same thing. She started talking about it. She said, "Oh yeah, my daughter's listening to all these wonderful books, Artemis Fowl, and all. It's just very fun, Percy Jackson and things of that nature." And she's just not as interested in picking up books to read because audiobooks is just fun and it's easy.
And the stories enjoyable. Are so simple, simplistic, right? Yeah. Whereas with audiobooks, there's no limit based on your reading ability. It's just based on your ability to comprehend. So how do we balance that between, us reading to our kids? It's the same thing, right? It's basically like an audiobook where there's no boundary except comprehension. How do we balance trying to keep good readers with their level versus what they can understand?
Well, I'm going to challenge you on the logic there, because these are individual examples, and that those may be the cases for your kids, but we may also not be hearing from somebody who says, because my kids started listening to so many audiobooks when they were 3 and 4, they couldn't wait to read themselves. So I don't think, I haven't seen any data that show that, but I don't deny that for an individual child, there might be less motivation to read if they are getting all their reading diet through audiobooks that are just easy and enjoyable. And I certainly do remember the phase where the books that my kids could read were not as difficult as the ones they enjoyed listening to. So no denying that. But I also think that what you've done with the audiobooks is help your kids build a relationship with books. And when kids are young, when they are 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, you haven't begun to see the payoff for that yet. One of my kids didn't read at all until 8, and I think it was largely because he couldn't stand the baby books, as he called them. And he was so able to listen to much more complicated audiobooks. And so he just waited till he was 8 to read, and then within a few months could read those books himself. And I think that at the time I worried about it, but looking back, I think all of that time was spent building a relationship with books, with stories, with authors, with words. And when he was 13 and 14 and 15 and writing songs and, doing high school level work, it didn't seem to make a difference at all that we had gone through that period. So I don't think we know for sure. I don't know of any studies at all that show that audiobooks delay an entrance into reading, but it's a thing I'll go look up after tonight.
No, this is very well could be in 1800s, us, and the doctors learning to be physicians, and we're all watching and microanalyzing our children. I fully admit that as a homeschool parents, we're just too focused sometimes on like the little micro details, and we should just step back and just say, chill out, buddy. It's going to be all right.
I mean, our reading specialist at school did say this to us as well, that she's had this problem happen. And I wonder if this is a bit of a newer problem because of the Libby access, right? And our kids can have access to audiobooks kind of all the time. I mean, our daughter can just tell the Google Home to play her a story anytime.
And she does.
Whereas, before you had to go to the library and check out the audiobook on CD or on tapes however long ago, and then bring it home, and then you had to wait to get the next one. And maybe it's like that kind of instant access part of it. So I wonder if that changes the dynamics a little bit.
I mean, maybe, but I can tell you that I was that homeschool mom who had so many audiobooks checked out that there was not a moment when my kids, I can read. One of my fondest memories of my kids' childhood was back in the day when everybody had to have a CD player in their own room, was going upstairs and standing in the hall and hearing, this will make me cry, hearing 3 different audiobooks going from 3 different bedrooms. And, so I get what you're saying, because it is different to be able to just, say, find me this book, and it appears and it starts. But audiobooks have been pretty available for a very long time, and motivated moms have been, keeping those library bags pretty full.
So I wonder if this is one of those, we haven't
homeschool
seen
dad paranoia.
Well, maybe we just haven't, we're cooking right now, and we haven't seen the final product yet. We're still baking.
Yeah,
I think partly, and I also think homeschoolers are different from school kids. And I think we also have to think about a lot of mainstream studies done on reading are done on school kids. And I personally don't think that necessarily applies to homeschooled kids. Some of it does for sure. Kids who need help because they have dysgraphia need help because they have dysgraphia, or if they need glasses because they can't see, and that's going to help them read. But I think it's also true that my kid who didn't learn to read until 8, who, if he were in school, we would have been really panicked about this, because he would have been already 3 years, quote unquote, behind. He never knew he was behind. He was still gaining knowledge constantly through audiobooks. And one of the articles that I've written for the Homeschool Mom is about how audiobooks help fill or help provide content during skills lags. So homeschooled kids who are 7 and 8 and 9 and aren't fluent readers yet can still know all the things about trains or dinosaurs or honeybees, or they can still know the authors that other kids are reading because of audiobooks. And school kids, I think, don't necessarily have, I mean, my kids listened to audiobooks when they were playing Legos, when they were jumping on the trampoline. And, you know, school kids are busy with school. They're moving through things in a classroom setting where they don't necessarily have that kind of exposure either. So I think we also have to take some studies with a grain of salt and say, my population of kids is actually having a very different experience than the population that this research was done for. This is me with the critical thinking again, right? I'm challenging the status quo a little bit, because I don't know all the, and certainly, again, some of it does, and I don't want to, I'm not dismissing research about reading and writing that is valid, but I think we do have to consider that our population experiences learning differently because they are at home more. So.
Yeah. It's a good takeaway.
Absolutely. Maybe pivoting from the audiobooks into, you know, writing, and then the act of writing, specifically with the handwriting versus maybe using a keyboard and doing typing. Do you have any opinion on, you know, what a parent should focus on, considering I don't think I've written anything with my hands outside of like check boxes and signing my name in years. Like,
yeah, well, and I'm really curious about this, because you talked
even just with our phones, we're always 2 fingers.
You
right?
talked about, you know, kind of the early, before you even put something on paper, right? That they're making up stories, do imaginative games, and starting to do storytelling. So I'd love to see, like, what do you think that evolution is? Like, when do they start handwriting, and then when does that move into typing? Or maybe, to Matt's point, does typing come earlier? When we learned typing in high school, so that was not like, you know, obviously it's different now. What do you see as that progression?
Yeah, we weren't pushed to start typing until, I mean, we were in college, late high school. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it has definitely changed with how technology is present in our homes that was never available to us longer ago, and much different. I'm older than you all, so very different from that many years ago. But I think it's pretty individual. The first thing I will say is that I really like the concept of separating the hand from the writing, meaning the hand that practices how to form letters and words on paper with a pencil, separate that process from composition. And a child who they will begin to put this together in their own way, at their own pace, and we can support both, and we can support it separately. So a child who is practicing forming words and letters, we can encourage and provide lessons for that, or whatever works for our family to help them grow in that way. But we can also be their scribe and write down their stories. And I remember I mentioned that at the very beginning, that's what my mother did for me, and that was part of what made me a writer, I am sure. So we can take away the challenge of doing handwriting at the same time that our kids are thinking up composition by being their scribe. And then some kids will gravitate toward beginning to use their own handwriting more and more, and some will either request keyboarding, or a parent will realize, okay, maybe typing is going to be the way here to get this through. And then yet another thing is having voice to text transcription and letting kids then use their own typing skills to clean up voice to text, like with Google Voice or with, I can't remember the one, Dragon something. Anyway, all of the other voice to text tools that can be used. And I think the main thing here is to keep the challenge of the using the hand to write with separate from composing the thoughts and getting them on paper. That's the most important thing. And I'll add that the third thing that I like to keep separate, and again, if you're looking for a curriculum, you can decide whether this is important to you. But for me, is the grammar and mechanics. I don't like a kid who is doing composition at the moment that they're composing to have to be worried whether they're spelling something right. Let them spell it wrong and let them not put periods in. This is the process called free writing. It's a process that I grew up with. I recommend the book by Peter Elbow called Writing Without Teachers. It's really old now, but it is how I learned to write and not have all these blocks of, what if I didn't spell that right? Or what if I don't know the answer to that part of what I'm trying to write about yet? Nope, just keep writing. Put your pencil to the paper or speak it into your microphone or say it out loud for your mom to write it down. Just get the content out there. And you will see that kids will begin to drop the accommodations as they no longer need them. One of the most remarkable things I saw when I was teaching in homeschool co-ops was we wrote a lot at co-op, and I let kids were allowed to handwrite, type, or use a scribe. And their scribe could be their parent, or they could specifically request not their parent, because some of them didn't want to, work with their parent for that. And I watched over, the same kids over a period of 2.5 years gradually drop their accommodation to get to either typing or handwriting or using their own voice to text proficiently without an adult. So I think if we provide those supports, they will find their way to the least. They don't want to be dependent on things they don't need because it slows them down. Mm-hmm. So essentially they'll drop it. They'll find the least interfering way to get their job done once they have gotten themselves to the level that they can perform that way. So So I love the voice to text. I love scribing and I love keyboarding. Now, I will say, as a writer who loves the feel of a pen in my hand, I love to write longhand. I always joke that my technical writing is on the keyboard and my poetry is on a yellow legal pad written by hand. I do think, again, if we look at research, I do think that there is something to be said for the process orientation of handwriting. And that for kids who don't struggle too much with it, it can be a part of the pleasure of writing that they can either grow into or enjoy, and it becomes a part of how they think. I mean, how many times have we said, I've got to pack for this trip and I don't know what to take. And we grab a piece of paper and start writing down the stuff we have to take. Okay. That list making, there's a part of the process of handwriting that down that does something to our brains that I know also happens in kids. I will also recommend for kids for whom handwriting is difficult, of course, you can do various therapies that help. A lot of outdoor play helps. We often hear small, fine motor skills, but I think also, large motor skills, playing on the playground and all that kind of thing actually really builds hand strength and coordination. But also doing art, and specifically Waldorf influenced homeschoolers do something called form drawing. And form drawing is where you're making little patterns, maybe a whole line of loops or a whole outline of a page with loops or rectangles or squares. And it's got sort of a mesmerizing quality to it, but it's much easier to emulate than 26 different letters with a capital and a lowercase letter. And so some kids will really start to have some of that same process orientation of the feel of the pencil or the pen on paper from doing form drawing, and it will lead into actually forming letters on the page. Now, I'm not any kind of specialist in occupational therapy or anything like that. So kids who need that kind of help should get it from somebody who knows better. I'm speaking as a layperson here, a mom who just sat down. We just sat down with colored pencils and did this form drawing. And I saw my kids who became the same kind of typist that you are, Matt, that they just keyboard. They don't write as adults, very seldom. But I saw them have that tactile experience that did seem to benefit them.
So I know that we want to like remove impediments from our kids, getting all of their thoughts out, right? So you're talking about the free form writing, remove the impediment of the grammar and the spelling. And if, obviously, typing is easier, right? Because you can quickly revise, you don't have to erase. And so that removes impediments. But at some point, and I don't know what this point is, but using, a pencil and paper or whatever does require you to be more thoughtful before you put something down, because, and especially if it's pen, right? You have to really be thinking actively before you write. And so that's not the right answer for the earlier writers, because we don't want them to feel the impediments. But is it high school level where we should start thinking about like, no, I want you to take your time, because there's going to be essays that they have to do for AP exams or for college where they may have to do them in person, and they have to be able to, think critically and be cautious about the words that they write without just saying, hey, we're just going to throw it all at the page and see what sticks, and I'll fix it later. Where does that kind of, there's a place in the world for that. And I'm not sure when that should come in to not, stunt their writing, but to make them be more thoughtful and take their time.
I write 100% of my stuff free writing wise without being thoughtful. 100%. And then I go back and look at it. And even if I'm under deadline or anything, and then I go back and edit it. And most formats that require you to submit stuff online, you have that ability to quickly dash things out and then go back and fix them up. And that's what I would still recommend that people do. We have a good article on the Homeschool Mom website that's called, I think it's called High School English Composition. Let me look and see if I wrote that down. English Composition for High School, that talks about this process. Many, many people write to discover what they think. They don't think and become thoughtful first and then write it down. And this is one of the most counterintuitive things about learning to write, and why I think we have many reluctant writers in middle school and high school. It drove me crazy when teachers would tell me to make an outline first. I don't know what I think until I write. I cannot do that. Now, as a mature writer, I might start writing and the outline suddenly starts to glow in the dark in my brain, because that just getting started, now that I'm an experienced writer, I have enough synapses cracking that all of a sudden I know exactly where I'm going. But as a 15, 16-year-old, I still was writing to discover. And that meant free writing first, and then going back and working from there to improve the writing, to add content, to revise it. And then that produced the most thoughtful, serious, analytical writing that I wrote as a teenager. And that's what I saw in my kids and in my writing students too.
And I wonder if I'm showing my age a little bit, and that's what we had to do in college is we had to write, in person for exams. We had to write those paragraphs.
The blue composition books.
Yeah, the comp books. And I wonder with the rise of AI, if some of that in-person writing is going to come back because they don't want them to be able to use AI to generate their work. So maybe they'll make people do things in person.
Or more oral exams.
Right. So what do you think about AI? What do you think about its role in helping our kids become better writers? How should they use it? How should we leverage it or watch out for it?
Yeah, I absolutely think that what you're saying is going to come back. It never left my homeschool or my homeschool co-op. My kids wrote in person at co-op every meeting that we had. And at the time, AI didn't exist and I wasn't trying to stave off AI, but I could get them comfortable writing to discover on their own, to finding out what they think about a subject or what they're thinking about today through free writing and through writing in person in class. And AI is going to be a tool that we're going to use, no doubt, but I'm not clear yet whether it's exactly comparable to the use of a calculator for arithmetic, as keeps being stated over and over again, because I'm not sure that there is the same kind of substitute for getting the inner thought life out and on paper. I'm not sure the analogy holds true. So I would say to parents right now, keep this free writing and then revising on paper or on the computer screen, but without internet access. Keep that going, because that's a kind of way that we're going to develop thinkers, and then have lessons and exposure to things like, ChatGPT and the other AI tools as additional lessons that don't take the place of learning to write, but that are, this is a technology that you need to know about and that you need to learn to use ethically, and that you need to use, you may run into in college and so forth. So we don't know where it's going to go yet, honestly.
So. Well, one of the funny things is they've seen a huge drop in users coinciding right with the end of the college semester and the open of summer. Kind of funny. I had actually 2 points on those. Interesting. I've heard people starting to say that ChatGPT is going to force people into becoming good editors. And they're going to read what it puts out, and they're going to say, that's not what I meant. And they're going to start to hack and piece it together and then generate their own output. But they're actually going to become very good critical readers, because this thing is going to produce stuff and they're going to go, that's not exactly what I wanted, and I'm going to now change it to what I wanted.
Or that's not exactly completely true.
Or true, yeah, or whatever that might be. And the second thing is, when I was in physics department in 2002 and 3.
Oh, don't date us.
When I was a sophomore in college, I was a youngin'. I distinctly remember my professor saying, I'll never forget it. He said in the room, he goes, okay, here's your homework. It's 5 problems. It's probably going to take you 10 hours to do it all. And he said, if you want to use, one of the tools, Maple or MATLAB or, whatever you want to end up using, I'm okay with that. He goes, I want you to do one by hand, and then you can print off the rest of them from the tools. He goes, because 2 things. I don't want you to waste time, because if you know how to do it, I don't want you to waste your time. I want you to do other problems. Second of all, I don't want you to make a dumb algebra mistake and that cost you a wrong answer, because I know you know how to do the algebra, but you're just going to, eyes roll back like a great white shark, and you're just going to forget to turn that into a negative or whatever it might be. And even 20 something years ago, they were okay with automated math problems. And he looked at us and he said, because I don't do it by hand, I do it on the tools. Because why do I want to waste my time, doing all this stuff? And I think
it was a programming. There was something you had to learn. That was a skill to use MATLAB. It wasn't like you just turned it on and it did it for you. But I wonder if this is kind of a skill too.
It was an input, and then it would go and do pages of calculations for you, and then you would print those out and give those to the teacher. And I'm wondering if ChatGPT maybe in its current form, and maybe in the next forms that we'll see over the next 5 or 6 years will apply in that way. But maybe in 10 years, it'll be a completely different animal and we'll have to approach it in a different way. But I'm seeing a lot of parallels with it, with things like Wikipedia and how controversial that was when we were younger.
Sure.
And these computational tools that we were using back in the day, and we saw the same anxieties, but they just became commonplace, and that we used all the time. And I'm just kind of wondering if it's going to be similar to that.
I think we don't know, but I think
Yeah.
you raised some really good points, and I do think for a kid or teen who is taking seriously what they want to get across, that idea that they will improve their revision skills is probably spot on. For a kid who is simply trying to get a grade to get through a class, probably not. But that's also always been true of all kinds of tools and all kinds of ways that people either do or don't do their homework. So, and I think even the ethical considerations are really important to, if kids are going to consider those, then they have to have some exposure to it so that they can understand how does this relate to plagiarism. I mean, I know I, for one, have had a lot of my material scraped, as they say, in order to be used to train these large language models. And I never told anybody that they could do that. And so I think there are a lot of unknown questions, not only about how they might affect our kids' education, but also how we might have our kids think about their own values in using some of these things. Is it really okay to go out and harvest the whole internet to train something that other people make models on?
Mm-hmm.
That you're not, that other people make money on, and that you're not going to benefit from? I don't know, but kids will have to be exposed to it to be able to have the question.
I see another analogy to the music industry when Napster came out and everybody was in the dorm rooms sharing, thousands of songs and not paying for it and everything. And that obviously had copyright issues, and that got brought down. But what came out of that was the understanding and the desire of being able to stream. And now I can go on
Right.
YouTube and stream every music I want. I can have a Spotify account
Yep,
and listen
and
to
those
anything I
folks
want.
get paid now.
And they all get paid. So I'm wondering if, like, whatever maybe illicit activities of scraping and teaching the LLMs on all this content, that coming out of that will be something new and something different, that we may have had like the oops period, and then it's going to then create some new industry or something of that nature, that then maybe
Sure.
ethical issues will go away.
Yeah, well, or you'll have the people who, like right now we have the people who are actors and writers who are striking against companies like Netflix and so on, because they are concerned that streaming actually took away their residual income. They can no longer make them, so this goes on and on.
All the time,
And I think we can't know. I think we would do our kids a disservice to let them overly lean on this kind of tool. And I think we would also do them a disservice to not have them know about it at all. I think we've got to, it's like so many things in parenting, right? Where you just have to
another thing for us to be worried about. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, we have taken up a lot of time, and we currently, nobody will see, but we have a 4-year-old banging on the door right now. She says it's time for dinner. And could you tell us, as a parting words, tell us a little bit about the homeschool mom, and what you do for homeschool parents?
Sure. The Homeschool Mom is a website that is one of the oldest homeschool websites on the internet. And so it has a really deep and rich amount of information for everybody from beginning homeschoolers all the way up through launching kids either into college or work or whatever they want to do after they finish their homeschool high school. And it is the place that I have chosen to have most of my work. There's good readership there, and it's a good place to get the message out. I do have a column called Ask Jeannie where I have taken questions, and that is sometimes a really good format, just like we love to read Dear Abby and Miss Manners and the other advice columns. This one is specifically about homeschooling. And so it's a very accessible way to consider challenges and things that might come up in various homeschooling families. So I really think it's a good resource. There are good state resources there, so people can find out their homeschool laws, they can find out activities, and they can find out how to get started and how to make it through these different transitions. So it's the homeschoolmom.com, all one word.
We'll go ahead and put the link in the show notes, and I would second it. It's a very great resource.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. I've got so much to think about. So we always appreciate talking with you. Yeah. So thank you so much for coming back on.
I appreciate the opportunity. It's always great to talk to you. And I love seeing your little one in the door, letting us know it's time to wrap it up.
Movie's over. Time to wrap it up.
That's it. That's it.
Thanks so much for joining us today and making us a part of your homeschool journey. Please engage with us on social media. Join our Homeschool Together podcast group on Facebook and find us at Homeschool Together Podcast on Instagram. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and recommendations. Until next time,
happy homeschooling!